How your inner critic is lying to you. Here's how to fight back against toxic thoughts. There is a voice inside you that sounds convincing, authoritative, almost as if it were delivering truth. It whispers at night, it interrupts in moments of silence, it cuts into your thoughts when you dare to dream bigger. This voice says, "You're not good enough, you always fail, no one will respect you," and it speaks with such certainty that you rarely stop to question it. But here is the reality. Your inner critic is lying to you. What feels like truth is nothing more than distortion stories stitched together from fear, old wounds, and the brain's own tendency to focus on danger rather than possibility. Psychology calls this cognitive distortion, the mind exaggerating failure, minimizing success, and replaying mistakes as if they define your entire existence. Neuroscience explains it through negativity bias. Your brain evolved to overemphasize threats as a survival mechanism. Useful when escaping predators, destructive when navigating modern life. Every time your inner critic speaks, it hijacks this bias, convincing you that one rejection equals total inadequacy, that one error equals permanent failure. The critic's power lies not in truth but in repetition. This is why resilience against toxic thoughts begins with exposure. You cannot fight what you do not recognize. You must learn to catch the voice in the act, to see it not as a reflection of reality, but as a mental parasite feeding on your doubts. Jordan Peterson insists that confronting chaos begins with naming it, bringing it into the light. Andrew Huberman adds that awareness itself shifts brain chemistry, because focus determines which neural circuits are strengthened and which begin to weaken. By naming the inner critic as a liar, you begin to rewire the pathways that once enslaved you. Thinkers long before neuroscience understood this battle. Descartes taught that the first step to clarity is not doubting yourself, but doubting the false authorities that claim to speak truth without proof. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed by the thoughts it chooses to entertain. Montaigne reminded us that introspection reveals how often we are deceived not by the world, but by ourselves. The wisdom is timeless. Your mind can be both your prison and your liberation, depending on which voice you choose to believe. This video is not about silencing your inner critic completely. That voice may always whisper. It is about stripping it of its power, learning to hear the lie without obeying it. You will see how this critic was born, why your brain accepts its distortions, and how philosophy and science together provide the tools to fight back. And more than fighting back, you will discover how to replace the enemy within with an inner ally that pushes you toward growth instead of holding you in chains. The battle begins the moment you stop accepting every thought as truth. The moment you begin to see the critic for what it is, a fraud, you reclaim the authority to shape your own story. That authority has always been yours. Now it is time to take it back. The hidden origin of the inner critic. The inner critic is not something you were born with. It is a voice constructed over time, shaped by experiences, authority figures, and survival instincts. In childhood, your brain is in a state of high plasticity, absorbing every signal from parents, teachers, and peers. When you were praised, circuits of safety and confidence were strengthened. But when you were shamed, criticized, or compared, your brain coded those moments as warnings. To protect you from future rejection or pain, it built an internal voice that repeats the criticism before others can. What was meant as protection becomes a prison. Neuroscience explains that these early patterns carve grooves in the brain, pathways that repeat until they feel natural. The amygdala, responsible for threat detection, becomes hypersensitive, scanning for mistakes and amplifying negative feedback. This is why one harsh comment often outweighs 10 kind ones. The brain's survival system mistakes criticism for danger, so it replays it endlessly, hoping you'll avoid the pain next time. The critic, in its twisted way, believes it is keeping you safe, but safety at the cost of growth is suffocation. Psychology calls this internalized voice an introject, a borrowed script that once belonged to someone else, but now masquerades as your own. Perhaps it echoes the disappointment in a parent's sigh, the ridicule of a classmate, the authority of a teacher who said you'd never be enough. These voices embed themselves so deeply that you stop questioning their origin. Yet when you trace them back, you discover they are not truth, they are echoes. They do not define you, they were handed to you. Philosophy helps us confront this deception. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the opinions of others are fleeting shadows, not the essence of who we are. Descartes urged that certainty can only be built by stripping away everything borrowed and testing it against reason. When you apply this lens, you see that the inner critic is not your authentic self speaking. It is a collection of old echoes trying to survive in the present. To expose the origin of the critic is to weaken its hold, because once you know its history, you stop confusing it with truth. You begin to realize that this voice is not a prophecy of your future, but a remnant of your past. And when the past no longer dictates the present, you take the first step in reclaiming your mind from the lies that shaped it. Why your brain believes lies so easily. The power of the inner critic lies not only in its persistence, but in the brain's readiness to believe it. Human beings are wired with what psychologists call a negativity bias, the tendency to give more weight to threats, failures, and criticism than to successes or praise. Evolution designed this bias to keep our ancestors alive. Missing a potential danger could mean death, while overlooking something positive carried little cost. Today, however, this survival mechanism distorts reality, making every harsh thought feel more urgent and more believable than it truly is. Neuroscience shows how this process unfolds. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, reacts more strongly to negative information, triggering a flood of stress hormones like cortisol. This chemical surge amplifies memory, so moments of embarrassment, rejection, or failure become etched in sharper detail than moments of joy. Over time, your brain becomes conditioned to treat criticism as evidence and to dismiss encouragement as exaggeration. The inner critic exploits this bias, repeating lies until the nervous system accepts them as reality. Jordan Peterson often points out that chaos thrives where structure is absent. In the same way, toxic thoughts thrive when the mind lacks the framework to challenge them. Without conscious questioning, the brain defaults to its primitive setting. Believe the danger, ignore the possibility. Andrew Huberman explains that attention shapes neuroplasticity. What you focus on strengthens. If you repeatedly give attention to lies, the circuits of those lies grow thicker, faster, louder. Your brain literally learns to believe them because you rehearse them unconsciously. Philosophy offers the antidote. Descartes argued that clarity is achieved only when we doubt even our most convincing thoughts, testing them against reason. Marcus Aurelius observed that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Montaigne added that much of human suffering comes from mistaking imagination for truth. When these perspectives meet neuroscience, the insight is liberating. You believe lies not because they are strong, but because your brain was designed to give them priority. The critic's power is borrowed from biology, but biology can be retrained. The moment you realize this, a shift begins. What once felt like undeniable truth is revealed as a trick of the nervous system. The critic may shout, but its voice is not proof. It is simply the echo of a bias designed for survival, not for truth. And once you recognize the mechanism, you gain the ability to challenge it, to redirect your focus, and to begin dismantling the lies one thought at a time. When your mind plays God, the inner critic rarely speaks as a suggestion. It speaks as law, as if it were the voice of ultimate authority inside your head. It doesn't say, maybe you won't succeed. It says, you will fail. It doesn't whisper, some people might reject you, it declares. No one will ever love you. This tone of certainty is what makes the critic so convincing. It borrows the weight of authority, disguising itself as truth, when in fact it is nothing more than assumption dressed in absolute terms. Psychology shows us that the brain responds differently to statements of certainty versus statements of possibility. When your inner critic speaks in absolutes always, never, everyone, no one, your nervous system reacts as though a fact has been delivered. The prefrontal cortex, which should analyze and question, often shuts down under the weight of this false authority. The lie feels like law, and you obey it without resistance. This illusion of authority has roots in early conditioning. As children, we are shaped by voices that carried unquestioned power: parents, teachers, leaders. Their judgments, sometimes careless, sometimes harsh, often imprinted themselves as truth. Over time, the brain internalized not only their words, but their tone. The critic now carries their voice, replaying it long after they are gone. What once came from the outside now lives inside, claiming divine status over your choices. Philosophy calls us to challenge such false gods. Descartes insisted that authority must never be accepted blindly. Everything must be tested against reason. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that opinions, even his own thoughts, are not facts, but interpretations. When you apply this lens, the critic's mask begins to slip. You realize it is not God speaking in your mind, it is an echo pretending to be truth. The power of the inner critic weakens the moment you expose this disguise. Authority without evidence is tyranny. And when you see the critic for what it is, a fraud in borrowed robes, you no longer bow to its decrees. You begin to question its verdicts, to demand proof, to strip away the mask until only silence remains. That silence is not emptiness, it is freedom. How self-criticism steals motivation. Every dream you abandon, every project you postpone, every goal that feels impossible, the inner critic is often behind it, not only in words, but in chemistry. Neuroscience reveals that dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pursuit and progress, is hijacked by cycles of self-criticism. When the critic convinces you that failure is inevitable, your brain releases less dopamine in response to effort. The system that once pushed you forward begins to shut down, leaving you paralyzed in hesitation, convinced that trying is pointless. Andrew Huberman describes dopamine as the currency of motivation. It doesn't simply reward you when you succeed, it fuels you to take the steps toward success. But when toxic thoughts dominate, they rewire the dopamine system into a pattern of depletion. Each time you tell yourself, "I can't," the brain learns to withhold dopamine in anticipation of effort. This creates a loop of learned helplessness. The more you criticize yourself, the less your brain feels capable of moving. And the less you move, the stronger the critic becomes. Psychology calls this self-sabotage. The critic convinces you that doing nothing is safer than risking failure. But the paradox is that inaction confirms its prophecy, reinforcing the belief that you were never capable. It is a prison where the walls are built from your own thoughts and the locks are maintained by your brain's chemistry. Philosophy provides a counterattack. Aristotle taught that excellence is not a single act but a habit, formed through repetition. Each small action, however insignificant it seems, generates momentum. When combined with neuroscience, this principle becomes liberating. Even the smallest victories trigger dopamine release, proving to the brain that effort is worthwhile. By reclaiming these micro-wins, you begin to break the hijack, restoring motivation one choice at a time. The truth is that the critic doesn't just lie with words, it poisons your chemistry. But the cure lies in taking back movement. Every deliberate step, every completed action, however small, is an act of rebellion against the hijack. It tells your brain, "I am still capable," and with that declaration, dopamine begins to flow again, fueling resilience where paralysis once reigned, turning accusations into questions. The inner critic thrives on statements. It hurls accusations with certainty. "You'll never succeed. You're not worthy. You always fail." Each statement lands like a verdict, leaving no room for defense. But cognitive behavioral therapy offers a powerful counterstrike, not by shouting over the critic, but by transforming its accusations into questions. When you shift from "this is who I am" to "is this really true?" you break the spell of certainty and open the door to possibility. CBT rests on the idea that thoughts are not facts, they are interpretations. Yet the brain reacts to them as though they are reality unless they are challenged. When the critic says you'll never change, the CBT reframe asks, what small step could prove that change is possible? When it declares, "Everyone thinks you're a failure," the reframe counters, "Who exactly is everyone? And where's the evidence?" These questions activate the prefrontal cortex, pulling you out of emotional reactivity and into rational clarity. The very act of questioning begins to dissolve the critic's authority. Andrew Huberman notes that focus reshapes neural pathways. By choosing to redirect attention from accusation to inquiry, you literally rewire the brain. Each time you challenge a toxic thought, you weaken the old circuit and strengthen a new one. Over time, this practice builds resilience, not by eliminating the critic, but by training your mind to respond differently. The critic still speaks, but it no longer dictates. Philosophy echoes this strategy. Descartes built his method on radical doubt, refusing to accept any belief until it had been tested. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the judgments we attach to them. To question those judgments is to take back control of the inner narrative. The power of the reframe is not in silencing the critic, but in exposing it. Once an accusation becomes a question, it loses its weight. And in that gap between the lie and your inquiry, you rediscover freedom. Freedom to act, freedom to grow, freedom to define yourself, not by the critic's verdict, but by the truth you choose to pursue. Philosophy of doubt. Descartes against the inner critic. The inner critic speaks with a confidence that feels unshakable. It declares failure as destiny and weakness as identity. But René Descartes, centuries ago, built an entire philosophy on questioning what seemed certain. His method of radical doubt stripped away every belief until only what could withstand rigorous questioning remained. Applied to the inner critic. This principle reveals something liberating. Most of its declarations collapse the moment they are tested. When the critic insists, "You will never succeed," Descartes would ask, "On what grounds is this certain?" The answer quickly reveals itself: none. The thought is assumption masquerading as truth. The critic thrives in unquestioned territory, feeding on the mind's habit of treating feelings as facts. But when doubt is applied structured, methodical doubt, the critic's fortress crumbles because its foundation is weak. Modern psychology confirms this. Cognitive distortions such as overgeneralization, black and white thinking, and catastrophizing gain power only when left unchallenged. By doubting them, you expose their flaws. Neuroscience shows that this act of challenging thoughts activates the prefrontal cortex, the center of reasoning, weakening the emotional grip of the amygdala. In essence, questioning thoughts reshapes both logic and biology. Philosophy and neuroscience meet here. Descartes gives the method, "Doubt what cannot be proven." Andrew Huberman provides the science. Attention to truth strengthens the circuits of clarity. Daniel Goleman adds the emotional dimension. Awareness of distortions breaks their influence over identity. Together, they form a weapon sharper than the critic's blade. To adopt the philosophy of doubt is to refuse to accept the critic's voice as divine law. It is to demand evidence where none exists, to separate feeling from fact, to insist that truth can withstand questioning while lies cannot. When you practice this, the critic does not vanish, but its certainty dissolves. And in that space of dissolution, you find clarity, an anchor stronger than fear, forged by reason itself. Emotional intelligence as a shield. The inner critic strikes hardest, not with logic, but with emotion. It doesn't carefully argue its case. It floods you with shame, fear, or inadequacy, leaving you overwhelmed before you can respond. This is why emotional intelligence becomes a shield. Daniel Goleman describes it as the ability to recognize, understand, and manage emotions rather than being ruled by them. When you name an emotion, you strip it of its ability to dictate your identity. Neuroscience supports this. Brain imaging shows that labeling emotions, simply putting words to what you feel, reduces activity in the amygdala, the alarm system of the brain. At the same time, it increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, where rational thought and perspective are restored. Saying to yourself, "This is shame" or "This is fear," is not weakness. It is a neurological intervention. By naming the emotion, you create space between the feeling and your identity. The critic's accusation, "You are worthless," transforms into a more honest observation. "I am experiencing shame." And shame, unlike worthlessness, can be worked through. Philosophers understood this long before neuroscience. Marcus Aurelius urged himself to examine every impression before allowing it to settle into belief. Montaigne confessed his fears openly, not to amplify them, but to shrink them into manageable size. To bring emotions into the light is to take away their power to distort judgment. Practicing emotional intelligence does not silence the inner critic immediately, but it prevents its words from fusing with your sense of self. The emotion remains, but you remain larger than it. The critic can shout, but its voice no longer enters unguarded. You become the observer, the interpreter, the one who decides what weight to give the feeling. In this way, emotional intelligence functions as armor. The critic may still strike, but the blows land softer. You are no longer pierced by every lie because you can recognize them for what they are: emotional storms, not eternal truths. And with that shield, you create the stability needed to confront the critic on your own terms. Marcus Aurelius on inner tyranny. The Stoics understood that the fiercest battles are not fought against the world but within the mind. Marcus Aurelius, facing war, betrayal, and plague, wrote that we are harmed less by what happens to us than by how we judge what happens. This wisdom is a direct counterattack against the inner critic, which functions as a tyrant and inner despot that twists events into condemnation. The Stoic method does not try to silence this tyrant. It strips it of power by exposing judgment as interpretation, not fact. When the critic says, "You failed, therefore you are worthless," Stoicism responds, "You experienced a setback, but your worth remains untouched." Seneca would add that difficulty is not a curse, but training for the soul. By reframing judgment, the Stoics created distance between events and identity. The inner critic wants fusion. It wants every mistake to define you. Stoic practice insists on separation, a mental discipline that preserves dignity even in failure. Neuroscience confirms the practicality of this approach. When you reinterpret an event, what psychologists call cognitive reappraisal, you reduce activation in the amygdala and increase control in the prefrontal cortex. The emotional sting weakens, clarity returns, and new behavior becomes possible. In essence, Stoicism anticipated what modern brain science now proves. Interpretation changes biology. The critic thrives on unquestioned identification with failure, but the Stoic voice breaks that chain. Marcus Aurelius would remind you that no insult, no defeat, no judgment has power unless you give it permission. Montaigne might say that much of life's misery is borrowed from imagination, not reality. And Descartes would affirm that certainty must be tested before it is accepted. Together, these voices dismantle the tyranny of the critic. To practice the Stoic counterattack is to reclaim sovereignty over your mind. It is to treat every thought as a guest, not a ruler. The critic may knock loudly, but you choose whether to open the door. And in that choice lies freedom, the freedom to see yourself not as a prisoner of judgment, but as the author of meaning. The body's forgotten role in silencing lies. The inner critic is often thought of as purely mental, but its influence is written into the body. When toxic thoughts take over, posture collapses, breath becomes shallow, and muscles tense as if bracing for impact. This physical state reinforces the lie. Your body signals defeat, and your mind interprets it as truth. Yet the opposite is also possible. By consciously shifting the body, you can alter the chemistry of the brain, weakening the critic's grip and restoring confidence. Neuroscience makes this connection clear. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that body and mind exist in constant dialogue. Deep diaphragmatic breathing signals safety to the nervous system, lowering cortisol and calming the amygdala. An upright posture and expanded chest stimulate circuits linked to confidence and reduce stress hormones. Even small acts, standing tall, slowing your breath, moving deliberately, can shift neurotransmitter balance. increasing dopamine and serotonin, and making it harder for the critic's lies to feel convincing. Psychology calls this embodied cognition, the idea that how you move shapes how you think. When your body adopts a posture of collapse, your mind follows. When your body stands with strength, your mind begins to echo that strength. The inner critic thrives when your physiology mirrors its accusations. Change the body, and you disrupt the cycle. Philosophy intuited this long ago. The Stoics practiced cold exposure, fasting, and endurance not as punishment but as training, reminding themselves that the body could withstand more than the mind believed. Descartes, though often remembered for separating mind and body, acknowledged their interdependence. What touches the body echoes in thought, and what shapes thought alters the body. To remember the body's role is to reclaim a weapon against inner tyranny. The critic may attack with words, but you can answer with breath, movement, and presence. Each time you choose strength in the body, you remind the mind that it is not helpless. And in that reminder, the critic's lies begin to lose their hold. Rewriting the voice of the self, the inner critic often feels permanent, as if its voice has always been part of you and always will be. But neuroscience dismantles this illusion with one word: neuroplasticity. The brain is not a fixed structure, it's dynamic, constantly rewiring itself in response to experience, thought, and repetition. This means the critic's voice is not destiny. It is a habit, and like any habit, it can be reshaped. Joe Dispenza explains that every time you replay a toxic thought, neurons fire together and wire together, strengthening the critic's circuit. But the reverse is also true. When you deliberately introduce new mental script statements of resilience, focus, and possibility, you begin to weaken the old pathways. The more you rehearse the new, the more the critic's voice fades into background noise. This is not wishful thinking, it is biology in action. Andrew Huberman adds that focus is the leva of neuroplasticity. What you give your attention to literally determines which circuits grow stronger. If you continually focus on the critic, you reinforce its dominance. If you redirect focus toward constructive narratives, you shift brain chemistry, increasing dopamine and serotonin around those new patterns. Over time, the brain begins to believe the new voice because you trained it to. Philosophy offers the same principle in different language. Aristotle believed that character is built by repeated action. What you practice, you become. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily of truths he wished to embody, not because he forgot, but because repetition carves identity. Descartes would agree that certainty is not inherited. It is constructed, piece by piece, through deliberate thought. To embrace neuroplasticity is to understand that you are not condemned to live under the critic's tyranny. You are the architect of your inner voice. Every conscious choice to replace accusation with truth is a brick in the construction of a new identity. Over time, the false authority of the critic gives way to an inner ally, a voice trained not in sabotage but in strength, building an inner ally instead of an inner enemy. If the inner critic has been trained through repetition, then the same process can be used to create its opposite, an inner ally. This voice does not flatter or indulge, but speaks with clarity, discipline, and encouragement. It challenges you without condemning you. It corrects without shaming. It reminds you of possibility instead of limitation. The shift from enemy to ally is the essence of lasting resilience, the transformation of the mind from battlefield to companion. Psychology shows that self-compassion is not weakness, but strength. Studies reveal that those who practice compassionate self-talk recover faster from setbacks and perform better under stress. This is because self-compassion reduces cortisol, calms the nervous system, and reactivates motivation. The ally's voice speaks in terms of growth. You made a mistake, but here's what you learned. You struggled, but here's how you move forward. It reframes failure as feedback, keeping momentum alive where the critic would paralyze it. Neuroscience confirms this process. By rehearsing constructive self-talk, the brain strengthens circuits linked to resilience and motivation. Dopamine and serotonin respond to supportive narratives, reinforcing the feeling that effort is worthwhile. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that repetition is the gateway to rewiring. What you practice consistently becomes what you believe. The inner ally emerges when you train your brain to speak differently, again and again, until it becomes natural. Philosophy, too, has always urged the cultivation of an inner guide. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations as reminders to himself, building a voice of reason he could rely on in chaos. Montaigne explored his thoughts on paper, transforming confusion into companionship. Descartes insisted that certainty must come from within, not from borrowed voices. Each, in their own way, built an inner ally, a voice of guidance grounded in truth. To build your ally, begin by noticing when the critic speaks and asking, "What would a friend say in this moment?" Then repeat it, consistently, until your mind learns the new script. Over time, the enemy that once drained you is replaced by a voice that restores you. And in that voice you find not indulgence, but strength, the kind that carries you forward when everything else tries to hold you back. Choosing truth over lies. The inner critic will never disappear entirely. Its whispers may still surface in moments of fear, uncertainty, or exhaustion. But resilience is not about erasing the critic, it is about refusing to obey it. The final rebellion is a choice, to stand in the presence of lies and answer with truth. This choice transforms collapse into clarity, shame into strength, and fear into focus. Neuroscience shows that this decision reshapes the brain. Each time you reject the critic's verdict and replace it with a grounded truth, you reinforce circuits of resilience. Dopamine fuels the act of moving forward. Serotonin restores calm, and endorphins release relief. The body and mind align not with paralysis, but with progress. Biology itself begins to echo the rebellion. Philosophy has always framed this battle as the essence of human freedom. Marcus Aurelius taught that you cannot control the voices of others, but you can control the voice you obey within. Descartes proved that truth survives only when doubt has burned away illusion. Montaigne reminded us that life's greatest clarity comes not from silencing chaos, but from meeting it with honesty. The choice of truth over lies is not abstract, it is the foundation of selfhood. To live this rebellion is to stop waiting for silence and to begin living with authority. The critic may still knock, but you decide whether to answer. You no longer confuse volume with truth. You no longer let old echoes dictate your present. You rise again and again, guided not by the tyranny of accusation, but by the clarity of reason, science, and meaning. Resilience is not perfection. It is the ongoing rebellion of choosing truth when lies feel louder. And in that rebellion, you discover the strength to fight back, to rise above, and to live as the author of your own story.